They're still young. They'll forget their mother. You just worry about the money first.
I was 6. I didn't even know what worry about the money first meant yet. Where did you get that?
You gave us life. Dad gave us a life. There's a difference. You knew how to leave a note. You just never knew how to stay.
You met with Xavier Kane twice, in Gold Coast. You handed him information about my father's company while he was trying to keep our house. That's a fact with a paper trail.
12 years of silence. And her first question, the moment she walked back in, wasn't, "How are my children?" It was, "Who controls the company?" So what exactly did a 6-year-old capture through a cracked bedroom door that night? And why did it take 12 years for that recording to finally be played? It all started on an ordinary Tuesday night in a quiet kitchen in Oak Park. My name is Cairo Helix. I was 30 years old. Back then, I believed one simple thing. If you showed up for your family every single day, eventually that love would come back to you. I was wrong about the timing. I just didn't know it yet. It was a Tuesday night in Oak Park, Illinois. The house was finally quiet. 4 high chairs sat around the dinner table, crumbs still stuck to the trays. Spaghetti night, the kind that ends with more sauce on the floor than in anybody's mouth. I'd bathed 4 6-year-olds, read the same dinosaur book 3 times because nobody could agree on a different one. Tucked Zion, Amir, Nia, and Zuri into the bunk beds I built myself out of pine board from the lumber yard on Roosevelt Road. I walked into the kitchen expecting to find my wife at the sink. Instead, I found a folded note propped against the napkin holder. Beside it, her wedding ring. Before we get into the story, if you've ever given everything to someone and still come up short in their eyes, stay with me. Because what happened next in that kitchen is the kind of thing you don't forget, even 12 years later. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, holding that little slip of paper, listening to the refrigerator hum like nothing in the world had changed. The note was 4 sentences long. Sydney said she needed more than this life could give her. She said the kids would be better off without the tension. She said she was sorry. Not sorry enough to stay and say it to my face. I sat down at the table, and because I'm the kind of man who needs to understand things before he can feel them, I opened my banking app. Habit mostly. The same way some men check the score of a game they already lost. That's when I saw it. 7 days earlier. A transfer of $2,800 moved out of our joint account and routed into one under Sydney's name. Labeled simply, consulting fee. 7 days, not 7 hours, not some sudden decision made in the heat of an argument we'd had that morning. She had been planning this. While I was warming bottles and signing permission slips, she had already been building her exit. I want you to understand something about that moment because it matters for everything that comes after. I didn't feel rage first. Rage came later, in pieces, on nights I couldn't sleep. What I felt first was quieter than that, colder. The particular grief of realizing the ground you thought was solid had been hollow for a while. And you were the only one who hadn't noticed. I walked down the hallway to check on the kids one more time before I let myself feel any of it. 4 small bodies, breathing slow and even, lined up in 2 bunk beds against the wall. Zion always slept with one arm thrown over the side, like even at 6 he was standing guard. Amir had kicked his blanket halfway across the room. Nia and Zuri shared the bottom bunk, hands almost touching even in sleep, the way they had since they were babies in the same hospital bassinet. I stood in that doorway a long time, long enough that the hallway light started to feel less like light and more like a held breath. That's when the tears came. Quiet ones. The kind a man learns to cry without making a sound. Because somewhere down the hall, 4 children needed him to still look steady in the morning. I didn't know yet what the next 12 years would ask of me. Didn't know about the lawsuits, the foreclosure notice that would land 18 months later, the email Zion would find on an old desktop computer when he was barely old enough to spell half the words in it. Didn't know the woman walking out that door had already sat down with a lawyer 5 months before she ever handed me a single piece of paper. All I knew, standing in that hallway with a banking app still glowing in my hand, was this. I had 4 children asleep in that room who hadn't asked for any of it. And come morning, whatever I was feeling would have to wait its turn, behind getting them dressed, fed, and out the door. Like the world hadn't just quietly ended in our kitchen. I turned off the hallway light. Went back to the kitchen table. Sat there until sunrise, staring at a wedding ring that no longer meant what I thought it meant. Wondering how long the woman who wore it had been planning to leave it behind. What I didn't know yet was that the very next morning, 2 more people would walk through that front door. Not to comfort me. To tell me I wasn't capable of raising my own children alone. Stay with me, because what Mrs. Bernice and Tiana said to Cairo the very next morning was only the beginning of just how deep this betrayal really went. He never asked about the car. That was the part that would surprise people most if they ever heard this story told out loud. Malik Rivers, standing in his own kitchen with a strange man's coffee cup still steaming on the island, said nothing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand a name. He just waited, let his wife hang herself with her own explanation. She gave it to him before he even had to ask. "Whose car is that?" he said finally, voice even, almost pleasant. Amara came down the stairs in her robe, fabric swatches in hand, answering so fast it sounded rehearsed. "Xavier, he's a new client, the Mitchell Street renovation. I told you about him last month." Malik nodded slowly. "You never mentioned his name to me, not once." He let the thought sit quiet behind his eyes, said nothing else. Went upstairs, undressed, stepped into the shower and let the water run hot down his back while a memory surfaced. 3 weeks old. A small thing he'd brushed past at the time. "Do you have the company's major client list? I need it for a mood board reference." At the time, it sounded like nothing. A wife asking her husband a work question over dinner. Now it sat in his chest like a stone. He turned off the water, dressed, picked up his phone, and called the one man in Atlanta who never asked unnecessary questions. "Ken," he said, "I need you to follow Amara, starting today." If you've ever had to act calm while your whole world was quietly falling apart, you already understand what the next several days cost Malik. Stay with me, because the evidence that came back wasn't just proof of an affair. It was proof of something far worse. Saturday morning, Malik made breakfast exactly the way he always did. Eggs, turkey bacon, fresh squeezed juice. He set Amara's plate down in front of her the way he had 1,000 mornings before. She sat across from him in her silk robe, talking about a design conference coming up in Miami next month. The keynote speaker, the hotel block rates, which clients she'd bring along. He listened, asked the right questions, poured her juice when her glass got low. But underneath the routine, he was watching everything. The way her eyes moved when she mentioned Miami. The way she didn't quite meet his gaze when she said clients, plural, without naming a single one. At 2 o'clock, Amara left for her usual Saturday yoga class. The moment her car cleared the gate at the end of the street, Malik picked up his phone and texted one word to Kendrick Hale. Started. That evening, the first report came through. A handful of photos, time-stamped, taken from across a parking lot in West Midtown. Amara, in a fitted cream blazer, standing close to a tall man in a tailored navy suit outside a glass-front office building. No embrace, no kiss caught on camera. Just two people standing closer than two business contacts ever needed to. Underneath the photos, Kendrick had typed a line that hit harder than any image could. This building was consulted on by your firm 8 months ago. Langston Group is now listed as the developer. Malik stared at his phone a long time, the kitchen quiet around him, the dishwasher humming through its cycle in the background. He had personally walked that property with his old client. He remembered the floor plans. He remembered telling Amara about the deal over dinner, the way he told her about most of his work, because for 7 years he never once thought to wonder where that information went after it left the table. A second message followed a few minutes later, almost an afterthought. One more thing, Kendrick had written. This isn't sloppy. Whoever set this up knew exactly what they were doing, and they've had practice. This doesn't read like somebody who stumbled into something. It reads rehearsed. Malik read that line twice. He didn't know yet how right it was. Monday morning, before his rescheduled flight to Chicago, Amara brought it up first. Easy, casual, the way she always delivered the things that mattered most. When you get back from Chicago, bring home the River Point contract, would you? I want to look over some design ideas for a new client. Malik's hand paused over his coffee cup. 1 second. River Point wasn't a project he had ever discussed with her in any real detail. Not the scope, not the client, not even the neighborhood it sat in. It lived entirely inside his office, behind a password she'd never once asked for. He nodded anyway, kissed her on the cheek at the door, got in the car and drove to the airport like nothing in the world had changed. On the flight to Chicago, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the clouds pass beneath the wing, running the last 7 years backward in his mind. Every late-night work call she'd taken in another room, every client dinner that ran past midnight, every question she'd asked that sounded like curiosity and was actually reconnaissance. By the time the plane landed, he already knew what he needed to do. He just didn't know yet how deep it would go. Tuesday morning, Malik sat across from Kendrick in his office on Peachtree Street. A manila folder closed on the desk between them, like something that might detonate if opened too fast. Kendrick didn't waste time with a preamble. He was a private investigator first and a friend second when the job required it. Right now, the job required it. It's worse than an affair, he said quietly, sliding the folder across the desk. I need you to know that before you open it. Malik opened it anyway. Bank statements first. 10 months of small, careful withdrawals from their joint account. Kendrick hadn't needed to go digging for those. The moment he'd told Malik what to look for, Malik pulled them himself. The same way any co-owner of an account legally could. Then a property deed, clean and public, pulled straight from the Fulton County records. A condo in West Midtown, purchased 6 weeks earlier, listed under Amara's maiden name. And beneath that, the part that made Malik's jaw tighten in a way Kendrick had never seen in 20 years of friendship. A printout from his own firm's IT director, who'd flagged something unusual 2 days earlier during a routine audit of the company's outgoing mail server. Internal project timelines, sent from Amara's company login to an outside address tied to Xavier Langston. Information that had helped Langston Group outbid Malik's own firm on at least 2 major contracts. Including, Malik now realized with a cold drop in his stomach, the very River Point deal she'd casually asked him to bring home from Chicago. She hadn't just broken their marriage. She had used it as a pipeline. Kendrick watched his friend's face a long moment, waiting for the anger, the shouting, something. It never came. Malik closed the folder slowly, set both hands flat on the desk, exhaled once through his nose. "Are you okay?" Kendrick asked. Quiet. Malik stood, buttoned his suit jacket with steady hands. "I'm fine." He picked up the folder, tucked it under his arm. At the door, Kendrick said one more thing. Quiet. The kind of thing only a friend who'd watched this exact pattern play out before would know to say. Some people don't do this because they hate the person across from them, Malik. They do it because somewhere along the way, they got convinced you'd never actually leave. Malik paused, hand on the doorframe. He didn't answer, just nodded once. The words stayed with him longer than he expected. Call Aisha Okoro for me, he said. Today. Kendrick nodded and reached for his phone, already knowing, the way only an old friend could, that the quietest man in the room was about to become the most dangerous one in it. If you found Malik's folder, what would you do? Confront her that same night, or stay quiet and let the lawyer speak first like he did? Comment yes if you'd wait. Comment no if you'd confront her on the spot. The lawsuit dragged on for nearly 2 years after that night in my lawyer's office, eating every spare hour I had. I fought it during the day. Most nights, once the kids were finally asleep, I drove to a rented lab space above a hardware store on North Avenue and kept working on something else entirely. A targeted compound delivery method I'd been chasing since graduate school. The kind of long-shot research most people abandon once life gets complicated. The breakthrough came on a Thursday at 2 in the morning when I should have been asleep. The result worked. Not in theory, on the bench in front of me, repeatable 3 times in a row. 6 months later, I founded a company and put my own name on the door. Cairo Helix. 4 employees, a modest office in Hyde Park. Within a year, an investment group out of Boston, the same city I'd once turned down a job offer in, put real money behind the work. I want to tell you it was smooth after that. It was not. Xavier countersued almost immediately, using the original patent dispute to try to bleed the new company dry before it ever had a chance to stand on its own. For nearly 2 more years, every dollar Cairo Helix made went straight back out in legal fees. I refinanced our house twice. The same field microscope I'd refused to sell years earlier, the one Zion unknowingly talked me out of giving up the night he showed me that email, I finally let go of. Quietly, without telling any of them why. Some sacrifices you can explain to your children. Others you just carry by yourself. We won the lawsuit in the end. Full vindication, the patent secured under my own name. But I want to be honest about what winning actually looked like. I walked out of that courthouse with almost nothing left in my personal accounts. The company survived. I, personally, had been picked nearly clean. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a long fight. Not the loud kind you see in movies, a quiet hollowness. Cairo described it to me once as winning, then sitting in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before he could make himself drive home. Researchers sometimes call this Pyrrhic victory fatigue. The strange grief of finally getting what you fought for, only to realize how much of yourself you had to spend to get it. Somewhere in the middle of those years, I met Imani. Through a mutual friend at the kids' school, at a fundraiser I'd nearly skipped because I was too tired to put on a tie. She didn't ask me for anything. She just kept showing up. At science fairs. At a 2 a.m. fever once Zuri's daycare called. At the kitchen table on nights I was too drained to talk much at all. She never tried to replace anything. She simply stayed, year after year, until staying became its own kind of promise. I filed for divorce myself, eventually, after nearly a year of waiting for an explanation that never came. It finalized quietly through the mail. Sydney never once contested it. The years after the lawsuit were quieter. Not easy, quieter. Cairo Helix grew slowly into something stable. The kids grew faster than I expected anything to. 12 years. That's how long it took from the night I found that note on the kitchen table to the night everything finally turned. Zion was 18 by then, interning at Cairo Helix 3 afternoons a week, already talking about graduate programs in biomedical engineering. Amir had started his second year at a community college in DuPage County, working part-time, keeping everyone laughing on the hardest days. Nia had a quiet sharpness now, the kind of attention to detail that made her notice things other people missed. Zuri said exactly what she meant every time without apology. They hadn't been spared the storm, I want to be clear about that. But they'd been raised by people determined to be their shelter inside it. And somewhere along the way, that shelter had made them stronger than I fully understood, until I saw them standing together as adults. Researchers who study children raised under long-term stress have a term for what often happens to kids like these four: earned security. A child doesn't need a perfect, conflict-free upbringing to grow into a stable adult. What they need is at least one consistent, dependable presence who keeps showing up even when everything else is shaking. In late spring, the city of Chicago held its annual gala honoring biomedical innovators at the Palmer House Hilton. Chandeliers, a ballroom that's hosted presidents, the kind of room that makes you feel small in the best possible way. Cairo Helix had been nominated for an innovation award for the very compound delivery work that had once nearly cost me everything to defend. I sat at a round table near the front with all four of my children beside me and Imani at my side. Each of the kids in formal clothes they'd picked out themselves, looking more like adults than I was prepared for. When they called my name, the applause didn't just happen. It built, starting near the stage and rolling backward through the room until the whole ballroom was standing. Zion rose first, then Amir, then Nia, then Zuri, all four of them walking up onto that stage with me, because none of this belonged to me alone. I stood at that podium and looked out over a room that had no idea what those 12 years had actually cost. I didn't tell them about the foreclosure notice, or the microscope I sold in silence, or the nights I sat in a parking lot too tired to drive home. I just said thank you. And I meant it down to the bone. Backstage, after the applause settled, one of my own employees, a young woman named Priya who managed investor relations, found me near the curtain. Her expression careful in a way that made my stomach tighten before she even spoke. "There's a woman out there," she said quietly, "older than the gala crowd, standing by herself. She's been asking which board members have decision-making authority. She asked specifically who holds voting shares in Cairo Helix." "Did she give a name?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. "Sydney," Priya said. "She said her name was Sydney." For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fall away entirely. Sydney's very first question tells you almost everything about the 12 years that had passed for her, too. When a person spends a decade orienting their choices around personal gain instead of relationship, that orientation doesn't politely step aside once the room gets bigger. It returns to type, almost automatically. Her first instinct wasn't, "How are my children?" It was, "Who controls the money?" That isn't a coincidence. That's a pattern, finally caught in the act of repeating itself. 12 years of silence. 12 years of birthdays she hadn't called for. And the first thing she wanted to know wasn't how her children had grown up. It was who controlled the money. I thought back to a kitchen table in Oak Park, 4 high chairs, a folded note beside a wedding ring. Some people don't really change. They just wait for the right room to walk back into. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Near the bar," Priya said. "With 2 other women, they're heading this way." I looked out past the curtain toward my 4 children, standing together near our table. Adults now, steady now, watching the door with a stillness that told me they'd already noticed the same thing I had. Sydney was walking toward us, and this time, I wasn't the only one in the room who knew exactly who she was. What happens next, when Sydney finally faces the 4 children she left behind, is the moment this entire story turns from heartbreak into something you won't forget. She found us near the edge of the dance floor, where the orchestra's noise softened just enough for conversation. Alone, I noticed. No sign of Xavier Kane anywhere in the ballroom. Sydney looked older than the woman in my memory. Not unkind years, just honest ones. The kind that show up around the eyes whether you're ready for them or not. Her hand trembled around the stem of a champagne flute she hadn't actually been drinking from. "Cairo," she said, her voice cracking on the second syllable of my name. I wanted to see them. I wanted to see my children." Beside me, Imani reached over and took my hand without a word, steady the way she'd been for years now. "You gave us life," Zion said before I could answer, his voice calm in a way that made it land harder than shouting ever could. 18 years old, standing the way he'd stood since he was 6. Like someone who'd appointed himself guardian of the people he loved a long time ago and never once stopped. "Dad gave us a life. There's a difference. We figured that out a long time ago." Sydney's eyes filled instantly. "I know I made mistakes. I was young. I was confused. I didn't know how to—" "You knew how to leave a note," Amir said quietly. He wasn't being cruel, just stating a fact he'd carried in his chest for 12 years and finally had a reason to set down. A trembling voice and visible tears can look, in the moment, exactly like remorse. But there's an important difference between distress and accountability. Distress says, "I feel terrible right now being seen this way." Accountability says, "I understand the specific harm I caused, and here's what I did to try to repair it." Sydney was, without question, in real distress. What she hadn't offered in 12 years was a single act of the second kind. Nia had said almost nothing the whole evening. She'd always been the watcher in the family, even as a small child. The one who carried that little hand-me-down recorder everywhere, capturing things the rest of us walked right past. What none of us knew was that one of those recordings had outlived every phone she'd owned since, copied over from device to device for over a decade, without her ever fully explaining why, even to herself. She reached into her clutch purse and pulled out her phone, her hands steadier than her mother's had been all night. "I want you to hear something," she said. "I recorded this when I was 6, through the crack of my bedroom door. I didn't even understand it back then. I just knew it felt important to keep." She pressed play. The audio was tinny, clearly captured on an old device, but the words came through clear enough to silence every conversation within 10 feet of us. "They're still young," Sydney's voice said, 12 years younger, flat and certain. "They'll forget their mother. You just worry about the money first." The orchestra kept playing somewhere behind us. Nobody in our small circle moved. Sydney's face went the color of the tablecloths behind her. "Where did you—" she started, then stopped. Nothing left to argue with. The voice on that recording was unmistakably hers. None of us had to ask who she'd been talking to. Xavier Kane's name was the only one that had ever come with a list of our assets attached. "I was 6, Nia said. "I didn't even know what worry about the money first meant yet. I just knew you said it like we weren't the important part." A 6-year-old can't reason her way through betrayal. She doesn't have the words for it yet. But children carry something psychologists call implicit emotional memory. The body quietly registering that something is wrong, long before the conscious mind can explain why. That recording sat untouched for 12 years, waiting for the moment it would finally be allowed to speak. That's when I noticed 2 more familiar faces approaching from the direction of the bar. Mrs. Bernice, in a dress far too formal for a fundraiser she'd only gotten into as someone else's +1, with Tiana trailing a step behind her. The same way she'd trailed Sydney into my kitchen 12 years before. We just wanted to make peace, Mrs. Bernice said, reaching for Zuri's arm. Family shouldn't carry grudges this long. Zuri stepped back before the hand could land. You met with Xavier Kane twice, in Gold Coast, she said, loud enough that nearby tables turned. You handed him information about my father's company, while he was trying to keep our house. That's not a grudge, Mrs. Bernice. That's a fact with a paper trail. Mrs. Bernice's mouth opened, then closed. Nothing in her face that looked like denial, only the blankness of someone who never expected to be caught with receipts. Tiana said nothing at all. She just looked down at the marble floor, the same way she'd looked at her phone 12 years earlier, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Notice the word doing the heavy lifting in Mrs. Bernice's sentence. Peace, real peace, usually requires an honest accounting first. What she was offering instead was an exit from accountability, dressed up in Peace's clothing, arriving only now that the consequences had already caught up with her. Sydney's composure finally broke. Not loudly. She didn't sob or make a scene. She just folded inward, smaller, the champagne flute slipping from her fingers and shattering quietly against the marble. I didn't know it would go this far, she whispered, to no one in particular. I didn't know it would still matter this much, this many years later. For 12 years, she had likely told herself some version of a story that let her live with her own choices. They were too young to remember. It didn't really hurt them. I'll make it right eventually. Hearing her own voice played back to her, in front of the children she'd convinced herself had forgotten, didn't just embarrass her. It removed the last comfortable version of events she had left to stand on. That's the part I think you never understood, I said, speaking for the first time since she'd approached. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It was never about how much it mattered to me. It mattered to them, every single day, whether you were thinking about it or not. I looked at my 4 children, standing shoulder to shoulder the way they had since they shared one hospital bassinet. Then at Imani, who had quietly held this family together with patience nobody had ever asked her to give. I took her hand fully in mine, in front of the entire ballroom. I felt no triumph in that moment, only a kind of tiredness that had been 12 years in the making. There wasn't much room left in me for anything but my own family. We're going to go now, I said. Security, alerted by the broken glass and the small crowd that had gathered, arrived within the minute. I didn't ask them to intervene, they simply did their job. Quietly walking Sydney, Mrs. Bernice, and Tiana toward the side entrance while the orchestra played on, unaware that an entire chapter of someone's life had just closed 20 feet from the dance floor. We left through a different door, the 5 of us, plus Imani. Out into the cool Chicago night, the lights of the Palmer House still glowing gold behind us. Nobody said much on the way to the cars. There wasn't much left that needed saying. What came after that night, the quiet dinner, the words Zion finally asked his father, and the moment 2 daughters called a woman mom for the very first time, is where this story finds its true ending. I think about Cairo's story often. I want to be honest with you about why. It would have been easy to tell you this story ends with Cairo rich and Sydney poor. Some grand courtroom reversal where she loses everything and he gains it all back tenfold. That's the ending a lot of these stories reach for. It's satisfying in the moment. It doesn't sit with you very long afterward. That's not how this one ends. This one ends with a man who still drives the same kind of practical sedan he's always driven, who still eats deep dish pizza in the same back booth his family has gone to since the kids were small enough to need a booster seat, who still has a company he built with his own 2 hands during the hardest years of his life. It ends with 4 children, Zion, Amir, Nia, and Zuri, who aren't famous, aren't wealthy by any extraordinary measure, but who are whole, steady, kind to each other in the easy, unforced way that only comes from having genuinely needed each other once. And it ends with Imani, a woman who chose, over and over again for 6 quiet years, to show up for a family that wasn't biologically hers. Until the day 2 daughters who weren't biologically hers either looked at her and called her exactly what she'd already become. That, to me, is the real ending. Not a courtroom, a pizza booth. Cairo told me something once I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said, when you're betrayed, you really only have 2 choices. You can become the victim of what happened to you, or you can become the builder of what happens next. I chose to build, not for revenge, because 4 children were watching me every single day to see what kind of man their father was actually going to be. He didn't build Cairo Helix to prove Sydney wrong. He built it because his children deserved a father who refused to quit, even when quitting would have been so much easier. Even when nobody but 4 small kids in bunk beds would have ever known the difference. I think about the blood versus family question this story keeps circling back to, because I suspect a lot of you listening have wondered about it yourselves, in quieter ways, over the years. You cannot choose the person who gave birth to you. Sydney gave Zion, Amir, Nia, and Zuri life. Nobody in this story has ever denied her that. But giving life and building a life are 2 entirely different acts of love. And only one of them requires showing up, day after ordinary day, with no guarantee of applause. Imani chose those children. She chose them on nights when there was nothing in it for her but exhaustion and a sink full of dishes. Cairo chose them every single morning for 12 years, long before anyone was clapping in a ballroom at the Palmer House Hilton. That is what real family looks like, more often than not blood. Choice, repeated, quietly, until it becomes who you are. If you're a mother or grandmother listening to this tonight, maybe on your porch, maybe in a recliner with a cup of coffee going cold beside you, I imagine some part of this story found you a little personally. Maybe you've watched a son or a grandson give everything to a marriage, only to be the one left holding the pieces. Maybe you've sat with that particular ache of wanting justice for someone you love, knowing full well justice rarely arrives the way the movies promise it will. I want to leave you with this. Cairo never went looking for revenge, never sent Sydney updates about his success out of spite, never engineered that gala appearance to humiliate her. He simply kept building his life, honestly, one ordinary day at a time. And the truth eventually caught up to everyone on its own schedule. It always does. It just rarely moves as fast as we'd like. This story reminds us that you cannot choose the people who give you life, but you can absolutely choose the people who help you build one. It reminds us that quiet resilience is never really about proving anything to the person who walked out the door. It's about proving something to the children who are watching you every single day, deciding what kind of person they want to become because of what they saw you do when nobody applauded for it. And it reminds us, gently, that truth and dignity tend to win in the end, not loudly, not on anyone's convenient timeline, but surely. A note left on a kitchen table in Oak Park does not get the final word. A father who stays does. If this story moved you tonight, share it with someone who might need to hear it. I'll see you in the next one. This story reminds us that the family you build outweighs the family you were born into, but building it takes specific, repeated action, not good intentions alone. If there's someone like Imani in your own life, a daughter-in-law, a neighbor, a friend's grandchild who keeps showing up when blood relatives don't, make it official in small ways. Add their name to your recipe box. Set a place for them at Sunday dinner without being asked. Mail their birthday card the same week every year, so it becomes something they can count on. And if someone in your own family once chose money or status over you, You don't owe them forgiveness just because the holidays are coming. Write down, in one sentence, exactly what real accountability would look like from them. Not an apology, a changed action, before you let them back at your table. These are authentic human stories shaped by real pain and real dreams. AI helped with grammar, flow, and structure, but the heart, the moral weight, and the life-changing lessons belong entirely to the human creators and their audience. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.